welcome to Concussion Talk Podcast. I'm Nick Mercer. Please go to www.concussiontalk.com to find out more about this podcast, my blog, and my ebook. This is my 11th podcast and my first of 2016. In this podcast, I will talk to Dr. Da Costa, a neurosurgeon at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto. Dr. Da Costa and his team are doing very interesting research into concussions. More specifically, they're looking at blood flow within the brain after brain trauma and the search for an objective indicator of concussions. It is fascinating and encouraging research. I hope you get as much out of this interview as I did. Hi, I'm talking to Dr. Da Costa. And about, he can tell you what it's about, what his research and his work is. So if you please introduce yourself and talk about generally your areas of scientific research and your specialization.
Okay, hi Nick, thank you very much. I'm Da Costa. I'm a neurosurgeon at Sunnybrook in Toronto, UFT. And I'm a cerebrovascular surgeon by trade. And we deal here too with a lot of traumatic injuries. So my main areas of research interest are related to cerebral blood flow and its relationship to injury, be that traumatic or ruptured of brain aneurysms or some other kinds of brain injuries that we see sometimes, like strokes, and also in developing imaging methods to measure this injury and to follow that. This is mostly what we've been doing recently.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I just had a question about cerebrovascular reactivity, but you already mentioned it. But could you explain to the listeners? I saw one of your areas of interest was cerebrovascular reactivity. So could you please just explain to the listeners what that is?
Yes. Well, simply put, is the ability that the vessels inside the brain have to react to some stimuli, different stimuli. So we have a similar process with blood pressure, which is called autoregulation. The reactivity is the reaction to chemical substances or to CO2 or to changes in the environment of the brain. So if you change something, for example, if you breathe more CO2, which is what we do, the vessels in the brain will constrict. If you breathe less CO2, they may dilate. And the same applies for certain chemical substances that you can inject in the brain. So reactivity is that capacity of reaction.
Well, thank you very much. So now actually I will talk about concussion. So your research obviously was in concussion and cerebrovascular activity, but first, how would you define a concussion?
It's a temporary dysfunction of the brain caused by a blunt injury, usually a blunt injury to the head. So there's usually no damage that we can see, like the MRIs are normal, the CTs are normal. It's temporary. Some people may lose consciousness very briefly, some people don't. I mean, the more complicated it is, the less likely it is to become a traumatic injury, such as a mild head injury. There's a bit of an overlap between the concussion and the mild head injury, which keeps going on to more severe injuries. But essentially, it's a temporary blow to the head that disturbs function and with or without very brief loss of consciousness.
Well, thank you very much. So actually, that kind of leads very well to my next question. So do concussions have long-term or permanent effects?
Yes. This was brought up initially by sports medicine, right? When you see that there's actually a movie about it now, where repeated injuries would lead to serious consequences. And we now are finding out that even in mild concussions, single blows to the head, you can have a percentage of patients that actually have long-lasting effects. Most often neurocognitive effects, like they could be depressed, they could be having trouble focusing, they could have headaches, disturbance of sleep, and of course that it's more if the concussion is more severe or if there are more concussions, right? Wow. So there's an important long-term effect in some people.
Definitely. So actually you were saying that because your part of your research was to look for objective. You want to find the objective indicators, right? Because you believe that, because you're saying that you believe that when patients come in, doctors have to kind of not guess.
Yeah, the way it works now is a trial and error, right? So for example, for sports, the player would hurt himself and then he would be taken out of play, and then there's some time frames and people would wait, and then when the player is feeling well, he reports that he's feeling well, and then they will try again and put him back to play. Some people go and can play, and some people don't. This is intrinsically unreliable because, I mean, first you're dealing with type A personalities. They're competitive players. They want to play. So how reliable is the report? We don't know. So it's well known that some people actually overlook symptoms because it's not in their personality to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
The other thing is we don't really have anything to monitor the progression. We don't even know. You do MRIs, and most often they're all normal, right? So more specific MRI sequences may see some things, but the usual average MRI won't see anything. And you have to know when that person is ready to go back. I think that's important. The same applies to the military. The same applies to construction work. The same applies to anything, right?
Yeah. So you want to find an objective indicator. So, and you want to use cerebrovascular reactivity to help you do that, or you're not want to? You're looking research lead that way. So what? What was that? One other question here. So what can the cerebrovascular system tell us about concussions and brain injury in general?
So it all started with severe brain injury. I mean, we know there's a lot of changes in the way the blood vessels in the brain react to different stimuli after a traumatic blow to the head. And this is important for us when dealing with severe injury because the most important thing is to maintain perfusion to the brain. So you want the brain to be fed by blood at an appropriate rate after an injury so you don't have lack of blood or you don't have too much blood in it. And sometimes that's hard because we find out that the brain doesn't respond the same way it would a healthy brain responds. So if I increase the blood pressure, sometimes the brain gets too much blood, which normally wouldn't happen. So there's some evidence that also happens in milder injuries. So these people are, they're at risk for a second injury, right? You may have heard some people have second blow syndrome where they have an apparently mild injury and they eventually go to have very severe neurological damage from a second injury that was also mild. And the other thing is to use these things to see if, since the anatomical MRIs are essentially normal, can we pick up trouble in the function? I mean, could we pick that up, and maybe these trouble in function is related to why these people have so long-lasting symptoms, right? So that's the whole idea behind it. We can't see anything on the form, so maybe we should look in the function to see if there's something that's not working.
Okay, so in terms of this research that you are doing or have done, I'm not sure if it's ongoing or not, but how soon after the injury, the patients you have, so for this, I'll start again, so for this research study, you examine patients who have had brain injuries or concussions?
Yes. So we did a few patients on a pilot study, and we took them up to a month from injury, and now we're running a different protocol, which we're just finalizing the data collection now, and we are admitting patients up to 2 weeks from the concussion. The average is 7 to 10 days, so it's pretty early after injury.
Okay, so and it's only mild brain injury, or is it
only concussions? Okay. And we do, for this study, we're doing the test twice. One is within 2 weeks, the other one is within 2 months, looking for that change in time, over time, that change over time to see if there is something useful there.
That was actually one of my questions. So my question was, given everyone's body reacts differently to stimuli, it seems this require a lot of monitoring of patients' cerebrovascular activity. So do you need to do baseline testing for vascular activity as well?
Well, no. This we do that for some neurocognitive tests. You have to do a season and a post-season one. For the reactivity, the patient is his own controls, right? Because what we do is that we scan you with no stimuli, and then we scan you after you're stimulated.
Okay.
So we have your baseline. It's a change from your baseline because it changes all the time, right? If I go for a run, I would breathe faster. My CO2 levels will come down. My vessels will clamp down a little bit. So that's normal. And it's a very dynamic situation. It changes really fast. So we use the patient's own baseline on both tests, on both bases.
And actually, because I read this, first found out about your research by reading an article in Sunnybrook magazine, the fall issue of 2015, and there's mention of it use a bold sequence, and I've looked it up, but so I know what is a bold sequence, BOLD.
Yeah, so bold is blood oxygen level dependent. This was a very smart thing that some radiologist research found out. It captures the changes in the amount of hemoglobin in the body, in the blood vessel. So if I dilate the vessel, I have more oxygenated hemoglobin in there. So the percentage will change between the hemoglobin with and without oxygen. And the bold sequence in the MRI captures that change. So it can tell us about how different the vessel is before and after. You know what I mean? Because the changes in the concentration of oxygen in that particular blood vessel.
So you're doing this study using an MRI machine.
Yes.
So given that you're measuring, using what you're measuring now, if this research leads to an objective indicator, will you need an MRI machine to test for it once?
Yeah, technically yes. Well, we've done reactivity using transcranial Doppler, for example, right? So you can also do that. The only issue is that if you want to know exactly where, because we don't believe that the brain changes as a whole. There's parts of the brain that would probably change more than other parts of the brain, or less. And the MRI allows you to discriminate between these places, so you can actually see the regions in the brain and how they react. So sometimes we have one that reacts very well, the other one just adjacent to it doesn't. And the other ways that we do this test, they won't allow us to see that so accurately. So it gives you a global picture. So the MRI is a requirement for the test.
So I get the idea that although you're looking for an objective indicator, you're not looking for one single indicator. You're looking for objective indicators to tell you. So how do you measure? Is that right? Looking for more than one indicator.
So the way the test is done is they measure. So the MRI picture is divided in something called voxels, which are very small squares, cubes actually, of imaging. And the reactivity in each one of these voxels is measured. And then you can average it for a region, for whatever way you like, white matter, gray matter. So you're measuring the reactivity in each one of these little voxels, and you're comparing them in different regions of the brain and before and after the stimuli that you give. So you actually end up with numbers, which could be whole brain or just a region, and you can compare them with that. So you can get a number.
So how do you measure it? You say you measure the voxels, the reactivity, and the change in the voxels. How is it measured? Like using what unit is used to measure this, or what?
It's just an index. So you're doing the bold MRI, right?
Yeah.
And then you have your CO2 that we have a device here that it can hold it in a certain level. So I can keep your CO2, for example, at 40. Okay. And then I'm doing the bold MRI at 40. And then I will give you 5 milligrams of CO2 extra. So in a few minutes, your CO2 will go up to 45. And your blood vessels in the brain will change accordingly, right? Assuming your brain is healthy, you will change accordingly.
Yeah.
And the bold MRI will pick up that change. So the reactivity index is essentially the change in blood, in the bold sequence, how much bold signal change divided by how much CO2 you gave, the change in CO2. So it essentially gives you an index, which is just a number.
So the return to play, which is the aim of this, how would you measure what constitutes return to play for you? What do you either just measure the patient again, or how would you
Well,
define?
I think we're very far away from that.
Okay,
Right now, we're trying to find out if there is a big difference between patients with just simple concussions and patients that never had a concussion, right? So once we
right.
find that out, we have to find out where, if there is a relationship with any symptoms, and then also how that evolves over time. So how long it takes to get better? Is it a month? Is it 2 weeks? What time frame is fine? And once we answer all those questions, maybe we can be able to say, okay, this is useful. And if you have a reactivity index that is not up to number X, you can't play or something like that. But we don't really have
Okay.
normal index so far.
Okay. That answers a lot of questions. Actually, thanks. This is I learned a lot in this little brief talk, and but you said you had there's more research going on there that you were involved in with your
Uh,
team, or
yes, we're doing some interesting stuff. We're looking to, before we started this, we're looking to say, well, maybe concussion is important, is not important. And then we looked at our own series of patients. We have a trauma clinic here manned by neuropsychiatrists, and they have a database of about 14 years of patients. It's like almost 2,000 patients with mild injuries that have been followed for a long time. Most of these patients are discharged now, but we have psychiatric data, like neuropsychiatric data, and we're looking at depression and trends to thoughts about suicide to see if this is increased or not. And it happens that it seems to be increased in this population, even with mild concussions. People tend to get more depressed, so that kind of told us that yes, it is an important issue. We're also looking into magnetoencephalography, which is an EEG kind of test that can be overlapped into an MRI, with the difference that it can probe deep brain areas to see how the brain function, electrically speaking, after a mild head injury, and it seems to be quite different from patients who don't have a head injury. In terms of electrophysiology, it looks like they use more brain to do the same tasks, and that would explain the fatigue, the lack of concentration, because they're actually using a lot of power to do a task that before the concussion will be done just with a standard low energy mode.
yeah, that's I say I find that myself that I use a lot more energy now than I used to just doing simple tasks like
Yeah,
making a
so
dinner or just not even that much, just going for a walk.
yeah, so that study with Meg that we actually published last year showed that they use a huge amount of parts of the brain that are normally not used in the control. So things are coming together quite nice. We're recently finishing writing a manuscript on subarachnoid hemorrhage injury, like the bleeding in the brain
Yeah.
because of brain aneurysms. And so things are interesting. There's some areas of the brain, very specific areas of the brain that seem to be correlated to neurocognitive deficits that these patients that recover from the bleed have, chronically speaking, like in the long term. So yeah, things are going well. I hope we're going to have some
Yeah,
good news in the future.
it definitely sounds very interesting. So, and you're looking at specifically the sports objective indicators, but you did also mention that there are neurocognitive, like there's depression, there's other
Yeah.
neuropsych
Oh
areas
yeah.
that are very important.
Yeah, a lot of things that come with a head injury, and it seems to extend even to the mildest forms, right? So one thing that we found that it's interesting is that the changes first, the group with TBI seems to react different than the control group. So we know that now. And it seems also that that difference lasts for much longer than we thought. I mean, most people will tell you that after 2 weeks you can go back and play.
Yeah.
But we have people up to 2 months after that, when they come back 2 months after, and there's still a significant difference between these two groups in terms of how they react to to CO2, and more importantly, so the difference is not huge, but it's how that correlates with their symptoms. Like if you plot their complaints and their reactivity numbers, there's a relatively good correlation. I mean, it's not very strong because the numbers are small, but there is a relatively good correlation between how well they react and how much symptoms they complain about.
Wow.
So that's we're on the right track.
That certainly sounds like that. Sounds like really interesting research. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this, to speak to me, and I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, anytime.
Thanks. Once again, I would like to thank Dr. da Costa for a great interview. It was very interesting. And thank you for listening. Please check out my website, www.concussiontalk.com. More blogs, more podcasts, and my ebook, Detour. The music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound. www.bensound.com.